Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Hi all, welcome back. If you've tuned in to listen to the next installment of the John Underhill story, we're taking a break from that story for just a week. And I hope you've been enjoying it so far. I mean, he was such a colorful character. I hope you'll pardon the interruption, but I wanted to take some time to kind of quote unquote advertise where we're going in the podcast with a trilogy of short bonus episodes that we're releasing together. These are standalone, synthesized thoughts, each with a slightly different focus, but all leading to the same place, revolution. Again, just a few quick episodes, previews of where we're heading, probably in about a year or so at the pace that we're setting. Now, these are blogs that can also be found on the website historywithjeff.com. So, welcome to bonus episode 1. Have you ever thought about what caused the French and Indian War? The argument can easily be made that this war represents the impetus for the American Revolution. From it stemmed a great need for revenue. How did it happen? What was the immediate precipitating event? What touched it off? Here's one view. The year was 1753. The Ohio Company, a private enterprise with government backing, was on a mission to economically develop the frontier district of the Ohio region. The French were engaging in their own economic development. A 21-year young major, with the full endorsement of the Virginia government, was tasked with delivering a virtual cease and desist message to his very active French counterparts. And that campaign was less than successful. The following year, in 1754, another attempt was made. This was an expanded campaign to rid the Ohio region of all French competition. Mutual warnings were exchanged between the English and the French representatives. A series of events with some conflicting reports culminated in the skirmish that is remembered as the Battle of Jumonville Glen, a short-lived victory for the English. Within weeks, the English would be forced to abandon their fledgling outpost, Fort Necessity. The date was July 4th. These events would later be recognized as the opening volley of the French and Indian War, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, the fourth and decisive war in 65 years between Europe's two superpowers, England and France. England would emerge the victor. What was the cost to the empire? How would that cost be recovered? The answers to those questions would play out over the next 2 decades as the American colonies ultimately thrust off the yoke of their English masters. The young colonial officer immediately involved in both campaigns of 1753 and 1754 was George Washington. So, welcome to bonus episode 2. Are you familiar with the Treaty of Paris? If not, it was the culmination of the French and Indian War in North America, among other theaters. The war itself had lasting effects and consequences for the European community. In North America, it could be argued that it was the prelude to provocative behavior, if not the American Revolution itself. Let's consider some of the facts. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 was a very big deal. It realized much more than the end to the French and Indian War in North America, whose primary prize was the development of the Ohio Valley. It was just one theater of a larger global conflict, the 7 Years' War, which had raged across Europe, Asia, and around the world. It was the final and defining of several wars fought between England and France for control of the eastern part of the North American continent between 1689 and 1763. England emerged victorious. Ultimately, the French colonial concessions in the New World were significant. In addition to most of India, Britain received Canada. France retained only fishing rights off Newfoundland and 2 small islands to dry their fish. Additionally, the French ceded eastern French Louisiana, the area from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains. Baton Rouge was included, but New Orleans was on the western side and remained French. The Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1762 was supposed to transfer Louisiana to Spain. Britain also gained most of the French Caribbean: Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and Tobago. France was allowed to retain Guadeloupe, its sugar colony, which was more valuable than all of Canada. Spain, as an ally of France, turned eastern Florida over to Britain. With victory came national pride, optimism, and debt. 9 years of global conflict had left England on the brink of financial ruin. Smuggling from within the empire was costing England revenue. Lastly, with the newly acquired land in North America came concerns over security and management in 3 distinct areas. Problem number 1 was security in the Ohio. With the official French influence removed, England was the only European power left in the Ohio Valley. Native American leader Pontiac feared that with the absence of French support, his land would soon be overrun by English settlers. Pontiac organized a successful campaign against English settlements and forts. Although he was ultimately defeated by the British Army, there was concern. The colonials had offered little support to the British in manpower, supplies, or money. Settling the Ohio Valley had many obstacles. There were several claims to the land, from private developers to both Virginia and Pennsylvania colonies. All parties were determined to cash in on the development. Who should develop the land? Who should pay for the security? England was already heavily in debt. It was decided that the colonials should be responsible for the cost. The fact was, it was colonial provocation and incompetence that had started the war to begin with. Though England was ultimately the victor, debt had arguably been incurred by the colonials. In addition to paying for the settlement of Ohio, it seemed only fair that they should help pay for the war they had instigated and debt already incurred. Problem number 2, a broken revenue system and tax evaders. The war had cost the British £70 million, doubling the national debt. To add insult to injury, it's been reported that the American colonies only paid 5% of the taxes paid by the British. Meanwhile, the British Customs Service collected less than £2,000 a year, 25% of the cost to run the service itself. And furthermore, £700,000 of goods were smuggled every year. The American colonies, though prosperous, were costing England a fortune, while at the same time depriving her of lawful revenue. Worse yet for the Treasury, corruption and bribery were rampant in the customer service. If a smuggler was caught and tried, it was by a local jury, who benefited from the piracy and simply did not believe smuggling was a crime. And the third problem, security in the American colonies. The cost of simply keeping the collective colonies safe and enforcing the tax codes was enormous. It was estimated the bill for security against Native Americans and possible French antagonism would have an annual price tag of £300,000. It seemed only fair that these costs be paid by the direct beneficiaries, the American colonies. The colonies disagreed. The Oxford Dictionary and Thesaurus defines provoke as, quote, to rouse or incite, to irritate, to stir, move, stimulate, motivate, prompt, encourage, push, impale, to annoy, pester, vex, rage, madden, incense, and infuriate, end quote. When you stop and think about those words, they are powerful and emotion-packed conceptually. Paired with the concept that there are 2 sides to every story, sometimes there exists foreseeable yet unavoidable conflict. Like 2 high-speed locomotives with almost unstoppable momentum heading straight toward each other. The stage was set. Now, from a colonial perspective, the way had been paved for westward expansion. The bounty was theirs for the taking. From an English perspective, colonial security, as they were constituted, was already expensive. Western expansion would increase that expense. It had a high price tag. So there's two questions. Where would the money come from outstanding debt? And who would assume the debt to come? As far as English leadership was concerned, all debt was colonial. So there were two identifiable sides: English colonials in North America and Englishmen in England. The stage was set for provocation. The stage was set for provocateurs, those who would incite, irritate, annoy, and infuriate on both sides of the Atlantic. Furthermore, after decades of disinterested monarchy, England had a new king, a king who cared, a responsible and engaged monarch whose government believed it necessary to raise revenue and reduce debt. What followed were a series of policies and actions that were provocative. The colonial reactions even more so. Here's where a conflict began, and what followed was foreseeable, tragic, and advantageous until the present day for all mankind. Worse yet for the Treasury, corruption and bribery were rampant in the customs service. So, welcome to bonus episode 3. This bonus, or advertisement, is just a quick overview of the life of King George III. No, you cannot really sum up the entirety of someone's life in 10 minutes, but you can introduce some major themes. And that's what we're looking to do. Introduce some themes that will be so very exciting when we get there. So consider George in this light. Imagine assuming the highest, most visible position of a much divided populace in government. By divided, we're not talking about a specific policy like taxation, foreign or domestic, but rather a systemic, values-based division from a foundational way of looking at the world. Divisions that cannot coexist. Divisions that are, in many ways, mutually exclusive in their ideals. These divisions are played out in a dynamic world as opposed to static, where these opposing views are fluid and adapting to any number of uncontrolled activities by any number of opposing forces on a global scale. Imagine if this individual, prepared yet thrust upon the stage prematurely, never allowed proper incubation, approached this position with all seriousness and dedication to the challenges. Coming to power through a hereditary process, assuming responsibility with advisors who have their own agendas, with great need and greater expectations. One with a definitive position rooted in tradition, yet open to conciliatory reason and a non-traditional approach to real-world, contemporary problems. What would that look like? No doubt this has been the case over and over in events and places both large and small, with people both known and unknown throughout history. There is a common example for us, and by common I mean an example familiar with our generation. This example can be used to work through not only the times for which he lived, but may be used as a tool and a guide for us today. There are a few questions to consider as we frame our discussion. Would he have to be a constant in the storyline? Could his biography serve as an introduction to the larger illustration? Could our consideration outpace and outgrow the character? Could a relevant and compelling storyline grow out of the initial subject? I believe the answer is yes to these latter questions. There are existential examples. The illustration, the springboard for our focus, is a known, often referenced, and much maligned character, a very tragic figure in a traditional sense. I'm speaking of George Wilhelm Frederick, Prince of Wales, who assumed the throne of the British Empire at the death of King George II, his grandfather. History remembers him as King George III of England, a man captive to complex times, deserving of a greater reputation than the insane king who lost the 13 American colonies. It can be accurately said that his ascension to the throne did parallel and contribute to a remarkable time in British and colonial history, and the world, the aftershocks of which we still feel to this day. Upon close examination, one is compelled to ask if history has been at all fair to George. Considering the world that he lived in, the circumstances which brought him to the throne, how would we have conducted ourselves? What passions and necessities would have driven us? Who would we have listened to? Critical assessment does not allow us to work through those times from a contemporary vantage, but his world, his experience, his options, his loyalties, his obligations, not ours, not the colonies, although their story must be a parallel consideration. Here are a few things to consider, a quick biography of not only the man, but the world that he lived in. To get a feel for the world of George III, it's important to consider and understand the immediate context of his life, familially, socially, and politically, both domestic and foreign. In other words, what were the circumstances that led to his ascension? How did he become the man that he was? What shaped him, or rather, who shaped him? From a historical perspective, the 17th century was a messy time for England. Political and religious strife from within and empire building from without consumed the nation. And in 1714, another watershed event occurred. Queen Anne died. She had succeeded William III of Orange in 1702, and initially she had been the Queen of England, Wales, and Ireland. The Act of Union in 1707 had also made her the Queen of Scotland. Anne was the first sovereign of the United Kingdom of England and Scotland. The daughter of James II, Anne was raised a Protestant, and her reign was greatly impacted by the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714. Also known as Queen Anne's War. It was during Anne's reign that the party conflict between Whigs and Tories escalated. She represented the last of the Stuart royal line, and despite 18 pregnancies, no children survived Anne. The Act of Settlement in 1701 created a succession plan through the Elector of Hanover, and at her death, George I established the House of Hanover. George was from Hanover, Germany. He spoke little English, knew little of English politics, and preferred Hanover to England. He reigned until 1727, at the year of his death. His successor, George II, his son, was similar in his preference for Hanover over England. Under their reigns, much of the crown's authority was abdicated to Parliament. When George III ascended the throne in 1760, he inherited a throne and a monarchy in disrepair, neglected by almost 50 years of disinterested sovereigns. At his ascension, he was proclaimed George III by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and so forth. His strong German heritage was not mentioned, though he was also the Duke of Brunswick and Luxembourg, Arch-Treasurer and Elector of the Holy Roman Empire. George preferred England. Born prematurely in London, he was not expected to live. His education was decidedly English. At the death of Prince Frederick Louis, his father, who would have been George III, young George, 12 years at the time, became heir to a global empire. It is tragic that his father died at such a critical time in George's life. Frederick Louis had been a caring father, concerned for George as his son and possible successor, and the type of man that he would become. George's mother, Augusta, on the other hand, was not as concerned. Although she was the official regent and guardian of the future king, she openly preferred Edward, George's younger brother. She was critical and insensitive to George, which had a lasting effect. His natural curiosity, once encouraged by his father, was now influenced by politicians vying for his favor. It was 5 years before someone would come into George's life and treat him with kindness and affection. That man was John Stuart, Earl of Bute. At a young age, George found himself emotionally and politically isolated. Imagine the effects at this time in his development of that neglect and isolation. What would be worse, to have had affection and lost it as George did, or to have never had it at all? What scarring had taken place? What permanent emotional damage had occurred? Such is the backdrop of the storyline most usually picked up sometime after the morning of Saturday, October 25th, 1760. when, at the sudden passing of George II, his grandson George III assumed the throne of England. He was 22 years old. His ascension to the throne was accompanied by political dissension and massive national debt due to a century of constant war, most notably those still raging across Europe, North America, and the world. The 7 Years' War, or the War of Austrian Succession in Europe, and the French and Indian War in North America. Related, but not the same. Both conflicts represented the latest struggle between France and England for global colonial dominance. Once the domain of Spain and Portugal, but now, in these latter stages, it was a contest between England and France. George cared about the monarchy and the empire. When he became king, his was an environment of personal loneliness and isolation. He was not even married. Chronic disengagement and abdication of the monarchy in domestic affairs, national political infighting, and international war, none of which was George's making, all of which was his to deal with. The debt incurred almost broke the empire. At the same time, the North American colonies had grown continually more independent of direct rule from England and more accustomed to localized, elected representatives from their own communities. Self-reliance was held in high esteem and gave birth to two modern concepts: individual liberty and political independence. It's important to realize, though they offered an abundance of natural resources for England and a large growing market for English finished products, the North American colonies may have been one of the least significant parts of the British Empire until 1760. They were very different from other parts of the empire. They were very costly in their constitution. Although they held firmly to local self-governance, they all shared two beliefs. One, they were Englishmen, and two, they had a right to self-governance, a political idea that was unconscionable for the time. The entire European monarchical system repudiated this. From the English government's and the monarch's perspective, they were Englishmen, but subjects, not citizens, more like property. The only rights they had were those granted to them. In conclusion, at the ascension of George III, you have a monarch who takes his crown seriously, an empire in financial distress in need of revenue, and 13 colonies who believe they will dictate their own terms of oversight and taxation. And here is where the real conflict began.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.